Hello again, and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. Hopefully, last week you had a chance to spend some time studying and pondering over the discussion we had on Paul, which should be helpful to you in establishing a good foundation as we study First Corinthians. That was the first half of the introduction. Today we will do the second half of the introduction, and we'll focus on the people of the first that he's writing to in First Corinthians. The Paul's writings, we need to understand those people that he's writing to, and a little bit how they differ from most of the other people he's writing to in the New Testament. Social historians, scholars in this area, believe that the church is made up mainly of a cross section of those Corinthian people, and these people are very different from the Peloponnese Greeks that inhabit most of southern Greece, and we'll see why here as we go through. Corinth in ancient times was a large and prosperous city located near the coast, but set back 10 to 12 miles for defense purposes from on this Peloponnese little isthmus. It was called, they usually, during the famous Peloponnese Wars, they were usually allied with Spartans, and they didn't have a big army, but they had a great navy. It is strategically located on this isthmus such that a reasonable portage across the isthmus can connect transport from the Saronic Gulf to the Aegean Sea, and then points east from there, and on the west side to the Corinthian Gulf to the Adriatic Sea, and on west and north to Rome and other places. There was much wealth in this community in ancient times as well as in Paul's time because of this trade and craftsmanship that was built around these portages and hubs, and it allowed ample opportunities for people to sell one's wares. So there was a lot of activity going on here, especially for that period of time. However, in 44 BC, about 100 years before Paul, the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar conquered this area and established the province of Achaia. He repopulated it. In other words, the Peloponnese Greeks were mainly moved out, and he repopulated it with Roman immigrants that he brought in from throughout the Roman Empire, made up mostly of recently freed slaves that had served out their servitude and had actually become quite a burden on the Roman economic system. So some of them very quickly took advantage of this opportunity when they were moved in there and became quite wealthy at the expense usually of the others. So by Paul's time, that is about 50 AD, that's when the scholars believe he was there. This society was still young relative to that part of the world, even though it was an old city, because it had been so repopulated. Historians say they had a significant amount of wealth even at Paul's time, but without culture. The culture did not develop because it was so transitory, and a large population of poor and transients inhabited the city. The Corinthians area was strategically important to trade, especially during periods in which the Mediterranean Sea and those other seas were too dangerous to travel, which occurred for a long period of time in that part of the world. Consequently, it was safe route of transport, despite this land portage that was necessary to keep them in some relatively safe waters as compared to the open seas. Also, land travel routes converged here for access to the world's sea trade routes as well as additional land routes. It was a place where wealth could be made and lost very quickly. And that's the attitude of those people at that time, the best that social and economic scholars can identify for us. Corinth was rich also in bronze and artisan crafts built around bronze, as well as being also a financial center for these crafts and for the sea trade. It was also very much an immigrant city, full of transients all the time, not just the ones that the Romans moved in, but based on the nature of the culture that was there and the sea trade. Nearly every description from the period describes it as a city with great financial wealth, but without culture. It was known to be especially neglectful of its poor and disadvantaged, exploiting them for financial gain. Of course, it also had a constant mix of sailors because of the sea trade who stayed for a while, mixed in, left, etc. So constant turnover of population. Corinth was well known also as a sin city, in great contrast to the norms of these Peloponnese Greeks around them, who, by the way, the Peloponnese Greeks are known for a very high moral and cultural standards. However, it was also known for, as Corinth was by this time also known for its religious diversity, in contrast to most Greek cities. Most of these cities worshiped the Greek gods plus a special god that was for that city-state. But here, shrines from many different religious cultures were known by the middle of the first century, that is in Corinth. At least 24 different religious identities are there relative to the temples and shrines that are recorded. So sailors passing through or tradesmen passing through could worship appropriately for their culture. Plus, it was also very famously known for a temple to all gods. That was sort of unheard of at this point in time. So that turned out to be a very popular place to stop and worship. It was in such a city that Paul arrived in about 50 AD and established a church of believers in Jesus Christ as the Messiah that later became known to Christians as Christians, but at that time they were not Christians. It developed as a branch within Judaism. He had previously established churches similar to this, but made up of different people in Macedonia, in the cities of Philippi and Thessalonica, which were north of there on the Aegean Sea. Religious scholars suggest these churches reflected the local communities where they were at for the most part, minus the fact they were worshiping a different religion than what would be there. That is, a subsect, if you will, within Judaism that later becomes known as Christians. The Corinthian church quickly became an energetic and enthusiastic congregation of early believers, that is, early believers in Jesus Christ, but was also a fractured congregation, scholars tell us. Paul's time with them was about 1.5 years before he moved on across the Aegean Sea to Ephesus and Asia Minor, which would be Turkey today, and established a church there. Apparently, somewhere around the summer of 51 AD. His time with the Corinthians appears to have been bumpy at best. So how much nurturing the church actually received from Paul is difficult for scholars to determine. So this word bumpy shows up quite often in the description at best. There's even arguments that he may have been urged to leave in a hurry and all sorts of things. It appears the church of Corinth quickly drifted away from Paul's gospel after he left, based on the range of alternative gospels that they were exposed to and moral issues that surfaced in these letters. Scholars suggest he wrote the letter that we call 1 Corinthians to them in the late fall or winter of 53-54 AD while he was in Ephesus. And he stayed in Ephesus much longer. We will discuss each of the issues that as they arise in this letter of 1 Corinthians as they surface. Based on the surnames that are there, in this, scholars say that this community was made up of Roman names, Jewish names, and some Greek names. But there probably were people from other cultures as well. So therefore, these are probably more of the leadership in the church. Most of these people, of course, were Gentiles, as contrasted with the small number of Jewish faithful as well as the Jewish race. The social, economic, and religious diversity found in the city seems to be in the church too. The social and economic ladder was steep in those days, which creates some of the bigger issues that Paul actually addresses, which are also needed in our culture today as well. There was much carping and infighting surrounding the dichotomy within society, and it was a constant social struggle as it is still in society today. When pondering carefully Paul's response to the 1 Corinthians letters, we will find that as we go through that although he's writing to a particular point in time, there's still an awful lot there that is consistent with problems that society encounters today. So it will be both a very historical book as well as a timely book as we go through it. Some primary cultural patterns scholars have identified that are important for us to understand as we enter 1 Corinthians include the following. First of all, father image. Father of the household is responsible in the culture of this time and area for the well-being of its members and units. And that extends also to Paul having that belief and value. It is the father's role that Paul assumes as he writes here. His role is to inculcate his values through training and discipline on this church unit. This is especially true in his example of proper behavior. He sets himself forward so often as their example for his children, if you will, to follow. Both sides understand that the father figure should have that role, and they expect it. So he will say this is his understanding of a proper life in Christ. With that understanding, then he expects them to emulate him as a Christian, as a faithful child. After all, he'll use the term, they are children of faith. Second point is this issue of honor and shame, or praise and blame. At this time in Paul's world, attaining honor and equally avoiding shame were paramount. They lived on a social ladder rung in which the rungs had that associated with it. Setting seating assignments, for example, at events were carefully arranged based on your social status as well as how well you had not been degraded in some form or fashion by shame. It was critical that Paul write in a way that he does not cast shame on their behavior, except where that seems to be his only option. It would have been very difficult for people in that period of time to receive a new faith mission had they have been somehow or another shamed. So sometimes he's not as terse as people would like for him to be. The third point is that this issue of Lord, little L, if you will. Everyone had a Lord in that society. That is, someone that they belonged to and was indebted with responsibility. At each case, it was a person higher up on the social order. Paul sees that now to be Christ with a big L. This, thus he was himself always often refers to himself as a slave of Christ. That is, my Lord is the Christ, this same status that everybody is accountable to. He conveys that to them. This move would have been difficult, though, and maybe one of the harder concepts for people to accept in that day and time, because that's not something we deal with on a regular basis, that we automatically have somebody who's our Lord. That was the way they thought. Even the emperor and says his Lord is a God above him. In their case, a Roman God. So this shift in lordship from a human being to a God figure at that immediate level in the social order is quite a surprise, scholars tell us, that these people had to deal with. And so this requires a paradigm shift. And much of that is underlying what Paul is trying to teach. The fourth point is these people are not Christian. We have to remember this term hasn't come along, although many of the values and most of the values that Paul is trying to teach are very consistent with what it's taught elsewhere that we generally think of as Christians. So it's, even though we may not call them Christians at the time because they were identified as something else, to us, yes, they are the earliest of the Christians. They did not think of themselves as Christians, scholars tell us. That term comes later. Most were illiterate, so they only heard the letters that were discussed. They regularly gathered for their church services in homes of the wealthy, which was very common for all sorts of gatherings, including members of the synagogue. The Jewish synagogue did the same thing, especially in the diaspora. Scholars say it is not clear how rapidly these people shifted from their other belief systems to adopt this new faith. A little more evidence suggesting they were operating under some sort of probably hybrid at best, and it was a gradual process, and Paul seems to understand that this was a big shift and it would take time. And therefore, he argues often for not such a harsh set of rules of requiring people to be Jewish in their actions. He is building them up by challenging and encouraging, mostly to a better understanding, is what he's expecting, as they gradually come to accept that Jesus Christ is the new Lord, as their Lord that they will adopt. Their community-wide acceptance of ignoring and neglecting the poor, however, he cannot leave alone. So he goes after this in a number of cases. Paul simply cannot tolerate that. Consequently, as much as anything, 1 Corinthians will be a study in love. That is, love to the degree of how do we function as a community and not just as an individual. So as we continue our study in chapter and verse, starting next week, we will address these issues as they come up, and we will make a slow, deep study of 1 Corinthians. Hope you have a good study this week.